Yo, what up, Toshi here. I wanted to make this video a while ago, but I decided to wait until now to make this video because we are receiving Dr. Ratio very soon. And Dr. Ratio to me is the epitome of a perfectly designed hunt character. But as of right now, the hunt characters have been very lackluster for quite a while. The only exception being Topaz alongside other damage dealers, and Seal whenever you use her in combination with Silver Wolf. But if you're not using Seal with Silver Wolf, especially against enemies that are not weak to Quantum, she feels pretty bad. And Topaz, if you're not using this character with another damage dealer to boost up the action for Nambi or increase the overall damage of said damage dealer, this character also feels lackluster. So what I'm trying to say is that the hunt path is dependent on other characters right now, which isn't such a bad thing, but we take into consideration that all the other paths in the game for damage dealers are a lot more self-sufficient, then there lies the issue. So the truth is, I thought Argenti was going to be a character that was not self-sufficient. I thought he was going to be a he can be a very selfish damage dealer, but he's not as selfish as I thought. He doesn't need as many resources as I also thought, because this character essentially does exactly what he wants to do in the content that favors him, and Pure Fiction is that game mode. He goes in there, he gets energy whenever a new wave spawns in, kills the enemies, has ultimate ready to go to kill the next wave, and he's constantly cycling really fast. And you have him with an energy regeneration link rope, this character gets his ult really fast and is able to cycle through waves, allowing you to progress through the game mode relatively easily compared to other characters. And that's exactly where he shines in situations like that against enemies that are weak to physical. But if you take into consideration, Argenti has a elemental skill that does a lot of damage to all enemies. And if you take the multiplier and times that times the amount of enemies on the field, that is going to equate to a lot of damage. Argenti has an ultimate that can hit every enemy on the field, and you can times the multiplier times the amount of enemies on the field. And then his second charge to his ultimate is the same thing, except it does more damage. And then the second part of the passive of the second charge allows you to deal up to 6 extra hits on the main enemy, or a random enemy depending on how many enemies are left on the field. This equates to a lot of damage, rivaling the multipliers of some other characters in the game. So the problem isn't that a character like Topaz can only work in single target scenarios, but she works in single target scenarios, and there's other characters that are able to deal more damage than said character. Now, despite being a character that can be played completely skill point positive compared to other damage dealers, generating a skill point for the team while also dealing her own damage, if you're not bringing her against enemies that are weak to fire, you're dealing a lot less damage. She is very dependent on whether the enemy has fire weakness or not. And her ultimate allows you to push the action forward of Numbi without having to worry about whether or not you throw a follow-up attack on the enemy. And then you increase the multiplier of said damage dealer, and then you increase the crit damage as well. But if you take into consideration that her ult is a large portion of damage in her kit, compared to some other characters, it's really hard to get damage out on this character if you're not using her in combination with some battery-like characters, or getting her ult quicker. So I'm trying to say is that the issues in Topaz's kit when it comes to energy isn't the same as other characters that also suffer with the same issue, because those other characters have ways of alleviating the energy issues in their kit. And it doesn't help that some of the fixes for Topaz's energy is baked into her Eidolons. Eidolon 2 allows Topaz to gain energy whenever Numpy takes a turn. But if you take into consideration that this should have been in her kit, this would have made the character a lot better. In fact, you'd be able to use her as a solo damage dealer because of this, because you will have your ult a lot more quicker. Now, you already generate energy whenever you are in the ultimate stance, but that's only 20 energy. And again, she's a character that isn't going to take that many turns compared to some other characters. And unlike Seal, who gets a reset whenever she kills the enemy, you're not going to generate energy as fast as her. Let's compare a dual DPS team with a Hunt character like Topaz to a hyper carry team with Argenti. The thing is about Topaz's dual DPS team is that you are dependent on a character that is able to buff the whole team like Ruan Mei, and you're also dependent on the enemy having duplicate weaknesses to the damage dealers you have in the party. So if you have a fire and lightning character like Jing and Topaz, you're dependent on the enemy having fire and lightning weakness. If the enemy doesn't have those weaknesses, you don't benefit from the additive buffs that Ruan Mei gives to the team, such as the resistance penetration, right, for every element in the party. You're not getting that extra damage that you're dealing to the enemy whenever you actually bring the element the enemy is weak to, right? Because you deal more damage, the enemy has less resistances to the element that you're bringing against them, and you just deal more damage when you're breaking the toughness of the enemy. And once the toughness is broken, you deal even more damage because of how the combat system works in this game. So let's talk about the hyper carry team. You're dependent on the enemy having the weakness of the only damage dealer you have in the party. And therefore, if the enemy is weak to physical, this team is going to deal a lot of damage. That's the only element you need the enemy to be weak to. If the enemy is weak to imaginary, that's even better because Locha does have a lot of toughness breaking in his kit, but that's just a bonus for the team. Now, you have a lot of characters putting a lot of resources into said damage dealer, and that's exactly what a hyper carry team is. Every character here is allowing this character to perform at their best, and you're trying to deal as much damage as you can in a quick amount of time. But one thing to take into consideration is that every hyper carry team is different. Some hyper carry teams are better. Like Argenti's hyper carry team, for example, deals so much damage relatively quickly and ramps up really fast because this character gets the resources he needs in order to do as much damage as he can because that's his job. When you're bringing this team in single target scenarios, it does fine. You bring this team in AoE, it does fine. So it's not about what path the character is in, it's just about how good the damage dealer actually is. Argenti is a very strong damage dealer. That's why he is able to perform better than dual DPS teams against enemies that are weak to physical, of course, right? Because he does so much damage and he is a very solid, good character. He has a very strong kit. So I know we're comparing a character to another character in the game with ongoing power creep. One thing to take into consideration is that Hoyoverse has a no buff policy for the characters in the game, because their goal is to sell you the solution to make the pre-existing characters better later on. For example, Topaz is going to become a much better character once you receive those characters in the team to allow this character to deal more action forward, more damage, push up the action forward of Numby more consistently because you have more follow-up attacks in the team, such as the supporter being able to give a follow-up attack, the defensive option giving a follow-up attack, and then another damage dealer also giving a follow-up attack like Dr. Ratio for his instance. Once Dr. Ratio does come out, these two characters should perform relatively well. But then that brings us to the destruction path, and why is this path as strong as it currently is? Well, that's because some characters are just extremely strong and they don't have as many innate issues as other characters. It's not about the path they're in, but rather how strong the actual character is. So a character like Jinglu having a very high multiplier, even on the level 1 of the elemental skill, you're dealing so much damage to enemies in the blast situations, and even though it's not hitting 5 enemies like Argenti, you're still going to deal a lot of damage because you have a high multiplier. And kudos to the game favoring this path anyways, because this is the most versatile path in the game. And then we have an ultimate for the same character dealing a lot of damage against enemies that are weak to ice. So the multipliers for this is really high despite having 3 enemies to hit versus hitting 1 with Seal's ultimate. And even though this character doesn't enter a buff state like Seal, so you don't take advantage of having your damage increase whenever you press your ultimate or you get a reset from killing an enemy, well, Jinglu already gives herself a lot of crit rate, which means you can put those stats and allocate those stats you originally had going towards crit rate to other stats in the character's kit, such as crit damage, speed, and of course attack. But if you have a lot of characters in the team party that have a lot of HP, you're going to take more HP, but you're going to convert that HP to even more attack for the character, thus giving this character a lot more stat steroids and dealing even more damage on top of the high multipliers this character already has. And then while you have your attack increase, you have all of those damage amps already going for the character. You get a further damage amp whenever you press your ultimate when you're already in the stance for the character. So I know we're comparing a launch character to a character that released 6 to 7 months later in the game. But if you take into consideration, as I said earlier, this is a game centered around continuously selling you options later on. Because if you have the strongest damage dealer from day 1, why would you worry about getting another damage dealer later on? Because your future damage dealer is going to be stronger than your current damage dealer. However, Hoyoverse does have the intentions of making characters in the past be more relevant with time, whether that's giving more game modes or releasing more characters to synergize with said character. Think of Sparkle, for instance, being a nice character to pair alongside Seal. This character will be a lot better with the arrival of said character. But it doesn't mean that Seal is a good character. That doesn't mean Seal is the best damage dealer. That just means that Seal is able to take advantage of a better support. And again, we're comparing characters at their core versus characters in their best teams, if that makes sense. So in conclusion, it isn't the fact that the hunt path isn't favored by the current contents in the game. Because even if this path still had a content catered towards it, well, they still have their innate issues. And even characters in other paths are also able to function relatively well on par with some of the characters here in single target scenarios, despite those characters being better in AoE or in contents where there's more than one enemy. And if we take into consideration that a lot of these characters in their multipliers isn't high to compensate for the fact that they're hitting one enemy, well, we're just going to evidently see why Dr. Ratio is a good character. It isn't the fact that he is a hunt character, but it's the fact that he has a very strong kit. He has higher numbers, and he has a lot of ways of dealing damage. And again, if you're playing Seal and the enemy's not weak to Quantum, you're not getting that resist penetration she has in her kit, and you're not getting that reset if you're not killing the enemies, which again, if you're using her in contents where the enemy doesn't have Quantum weakness, it's really hard to get resets on the character against mobs, because with the ever-growing HP of mobs in this game, Seal is becoming a lot more lackluster whenever you're not bringing her against enemies that are weak to Quantum. And again, Dr. Ratio, even though he is an imaginary character, one of the strongest elements in the game, that really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things because he just has very high multipliers and he does exactly what he sets out to do, and that is be the best in single target. And while Lycone does play a nice part in a character's overall damage, for the most part, Lycones in this game are relatively balanced compared to the 5-star counterparts. So a 4-star counterpart at max refinements isn't going to be that much of a significant drop compared to a 5-star Lycone for the character. So that's part of the reason why I didn't decide to bring up Lycones for respective paths, even though they do make up a decent amount of portion of the damage for the character. It's just the character being bad or good, or their kit being nice to use in all contents, or their kit being okay to use in some other contents, if that makes sense. So there you have it. I think this video would have been a lot more easier to make if I was just scripting instead of just rambling like I always do. But I want to get this video out because I thought about this for a while, ever since the release of Topaz, and I was wondering why the hunt path was actually not good. It wasn't because the path doesn't have content favoring the characters, because MOC for the most part does have 2 elites now. I mean, hunt should excel in those contents, but the truth is that hunt characters just don't have good multipliers to make up for the fact that they're only hitting one enemy. And I believe Seal should be able to deal more damage to enemies, right, in order to get the resets on those additional mobs, right, those subordinates, in those 2 elite scenarios. But if the enemy isn't weak to Quantum, you don't have like Silverwolf or Sparkle, it's going to be really hard to get those resets in. So therefore, her compared to other characters that don't have to go through the hassle of getting resets to get an additional turn to deal more damage, even though I find that playstyle a lot more fun than just pressing E over and over and over again on a character like Jing Lu or Daniel, for instance, you know, we're going to see why Dr. Ratio is a very good character, despite being in the same path with all the other characters that suffer from the same innate issues. He just has very high multipliers to compensate for the fact that he's a single target damage dealer and more ways of dealing damage. That's the video here. Thank you for watching and have a nice rest of your day. Peace.